In the rolling landscapes of southeastern Nigeria, far from the golden pyramids of Egypt or the stone citadels of Great Zimbabwe, lies the memory of a kingdom that defies what many think they know about African history. A kingdom that wielded power not with armies or swords, but with spirituality, diplomacy, and sacred authority. A kingdom so unique that its rulers were seen not as kings, but as divine mediators between heaven and earth. This was the kingdom of Nri, a forgotten civilization whose legacy has been buried beneath centuries of silence, yet whose story is so profound it forces us to rethink the very foundations of African history. The kingdom of Nri, rooted in the traditions of the Igbo people, is often described as one of the oldest and most intriguing political systems in sub-Saharan Africa. Unlike most empires that rose and fell with the clash of armies and the thirst for conquest, Nri's power rested on a different foundation. It was spiritual, ritualistic, and deeply moral. An empire where bloodshed was forbidden, where rulers ruled not through fear, but through sacred oaths, persuasion, and ritual authority, in a world dominated by warlords and warriors. The Nri model stands as both revolutionary and puzzling, a system that thrived for centuries without the iron fist of a standing army. But how did such a kingdom emerge, and why is it so often forgotten in the telling of African history? The story begins, as so many African legends do, with a myth of origin. For the Igbo trace the birth of Nri to a mystical figure, Hare, said to be a divine being sent from the sky by Chukwu, the supreme god. Hare descended to earth and settled by the Anambra River, where he founded the first settlements that would eventually become the nucleus of the Nri civilization. His descendants carried the sacred authority of his divine origin, giving the rulers of Nri, known as Eze Nri, a spiritual legitimacy unlike any other. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the Nri kingdom was taking form. At its peak between the 10th and 16th centuries, it became a network of influence stretching across what is today southeastern Nigeria and beyond, covering vast regions of Igbo land and extending into neighboring territories. But unlike Oyo with its cavalry or Dahomey with its Amazons, Nri expanded not through military conquest, but through ritual authority. The Eze Nri held no standing army, did not fortify cities with walls, and did not send soldiers to conquer neighbors. Instead, his power rested in a spiritual mandate. Through rituals of cleansing, initiation, and the sacred redistribution of land, the Eze Nri bound communities together in a web of spiritual allegiance. Central to this authority were the priests and ritual specialists who traveled from Nri to distant villages, spreading the influence of the Eze Nri. These emissaries carried with them sacred objects, bracelets, staffs, shells, that symbolized the divine sanction of Nri. Their duty was to settle disputes, cleanse abominations, and enforce sacred laws that forbade murder, theft, and incest. Wherever these emissaries went, they established the authority of Nri. Villages accepted their rulings because to defy them was to defy the gods themselves. In this way, the Nri kingdom expanded, not by blood but by belief, not by swords but by symbols. This unique form of governance has baffled historians, for in a world where might was often the measure of legitimacy, how could a state survive and thrive without armies? The answer lies in the deeply religious worldview of the Igbo. For them, life was not merely political, but profoundly spiritual. Every act carried cosmic weight, every oath tied to ancestral spirits, and the Eze Nri, as the ritual center of this universe, became indispensable. His ability to cleanse sins and restore harmony gave him authority that transcended mere earthly politics. In fact, the Eze Nri was so sacred that he was forbidden from engaging in war, forbidden from spilling blood. His power lay precisely in his detachment from violence. The influence of Nri stretched far. Archaeological findings reveal evidence of sophisticated bronze and copper artworks linked to Nri culture, particularly the famed Igbo Ukwu bronzes, dating as far back as the 9th century. These works display an extraordinary level of metallurgical skill, intricate detailing, and symbolic imagery that point to a highly advanced society. They depict figures adorned with regalia, vessels decorated with sacred motifs and ritual objects that reinforce the sacred authority of the Nri priesthood. These bronzes stand alongside the greatest artworks of Africa. Yet for centuries, They were neglected in global narratives of civilization. But while Nri rejected war, the world around it was anything but peaceful. Neighboring states rose and fell through violence. The slave trade ravaged West Africa, and empires like Benin, Oyo, and Dahomey thrived on military might. How then did Nri navigate this dangerous landscape? The answer lies in diplomacy and ritual control. Nri emissaries could enter slave markets and liberate those considered ritually polluted, such as those guilty of taboo crimes, by declaring them cleansed and free. In this way, Nri maintained a form of moral authority that both challenged and coexisted with the bloody realities of the time. However, this moral and spiritual empire was not invulnerable by the 17th and 18th centuries. The rise of the Atlantic slave trade and the growing militarization of neighboring states undermined Nri's authority. The world was shifting from spiritual diplomacy to guns and cannons and kingdoms that could not defend themselves. Militarily were increasingly marginalized. As European traders funneled firearms into coastal states, the balance of power shifted, and Nri, with its refusal to shed blood, began to fade from prominence. By the 19th century, the once mighty spiritual web of Nri influence had dwindled. Communities increasingly turned to militarized kingdoms for protection or to participate in the booming slave economy. And when British colonial forces invaded the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the final vestiges of Nri authority were dismantled. The Eze Nri lost his ritual supremacy, and the kingdom slipped into obscurity, remembered only in fragments of oral tradition and in the artifacts unearthed from Igbo Ukwu. Yet the story of Nri remains one of the most compelling in African history. It challenges the notion that power must always come from violence, that empires are only built on conquest. The Nri model shows an alternative, one where spirituality, ritual, and morality form the glue of society, where rulers were obeyed not because they could kill, but because they could cleanse, not because they conquered, but because they restored harmony. In an age when we often associate power with domination, Nri reminds us that there was once a kingdom where peace itself was the foundation of rule. But why has this kingdom been so forgotten? Why do we hear endlessly of Egypt, Mali, and Benin, but so little of Nri? Part of the reason lies in the colonial rewriting of African history. European powers preferred to highlight states that fit their own frameworks of war and empire. They downplayed or ignored systems that could not be easily understood through the lens of armies and conquest. And so Nri, an empire of the mind and spirit, was sidelined, left in shadows, and nearly erased from global memory. Today, however, scholars and storytellers are beginning to reclaim this history. The Eze Nri continues to exist as a cultural and spiritual title in Igboland, and the memory of the kingdom endures in festivals, rituals, and oral traditions. The rediscovery of Igbo Ukwu bronzes has forced art historians to recognize the sophistication of Igbo metallurgy centuries before Europeans arrived. And the very existence of Nri forces us to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to be powerful? Is power the ability to destroy or the ability to preserve? Is it the command of armies or the command of hearts and minds? The forgotten kingdom of Nri stands as a testament to a different vision of civilization, one that dared to build on peace in a violent age, one that placed morality above conquest, one that defied the logic of empire and still carved its name into the story of Africa. Though often buried beneath the louder tales of warriors and conquerors, its voice still whispers through time, reminding us that history is not only made by those who wield the sword, but also by those who choose to lay it down.